obviously I changed, I talked about changing, what I was going to speak on, and I'll get to our scripture in a moment, but it's honestly, this is kind of my favorite way to preach, is like take a passage and just kind of go like verse by verse by verse, read, talk, because I think when you look at the scriptures, there's so much that's relevant for the time and the world that we live in today. And it's crazy to me that a text that's, assembled literally 1,800 years ago and was written in some cases 3,000 years ago is so applicable to what we experience and what we face today. And specifically in a time like this, when we have, a lot of different, news and bits of information that are being thrown at us from all sorts of different directions. Some of it is helpful, some of it is frightening, some of it is practical, some of it is misleading, and it comes from every direction. And I think sometimes because we have access to so much stuff, we live in information overload, that there's so many benefits to it. But in a time like this, it can feel overwhelming, where, and when it's not just the access or the amount of information that we have, but also our binging nature, where we are so accustomed to, okay, Netflix autoplays the next one, and then YouTube autoplays the next one, Spotify shuffles to the next one, and everything is just so, we've been kind of ingrained in us that we just move from one thing to the next, to the next, to the next. And so when you're trying to kind of educate yourself or find out about what's real, what's not, it's not even that you have the chance or the moment to distinguish between the two. You just find yourself getting sucked into something, whether it's reading something, watching something, talking about something, and all of a sudden, all of the stuff that's happening around us becomes kind of this 24/7, not news cycle, although that's true as well, but a 24/7 consuming kind of mindset. You go to sleep thinking about it, you wake up thinking about it, you read something else about it, you get in a conversation about it, it triggers this, and then you start doing all sorts of different things with it. And I think one of the things that I realized, in positioning and pivoting, where we were headed, is that, I wanted to be able to kind of step into that and speak a little bit to, times like these, because I think one of the things that happens in situations like this is that fear, of course, becomes a driving and motivating driver for our behavior, for our attitudes, for our actions, and even for our engagements. And fear becomes something that really has the ability to accelerate things, and in a weird or bizarre way, and sometimes a very dangerous way and potent way, actually unify people and create a momentum around something. And really, most people, or a lot of people, don't even know if that's the direction they want to head in. They're just moving that way because everyone else is going that way. And I think one of the things that we have to be aware of as followers of Jesus, people who have committed to following Christ and to living our lives in submission, not to fear, but to God, is that fear's intent is to divide. Fear's intent is not just to divide, but then after it's divided, it's intended to isolate. And then after it's isolated, it attempts to kind of blur what's fact from what's fiction. And fear just has a rapid way of doing that and moving people from those stages or through those stages from, okay, divide, let me separate, this, let me just kind of stand off or remove myself from this and divide, something that potentially could be helpful. And then it isolates and you're all on your own. And then when you're isolated, you're vulnerable. And because you're vulnerable, you don't know what to believe anymore. And that becomes very confusing. And my goal today is not to offer a treatise on COVID-19 or coronavirus or, a medical journal synopsis of what's real and what's not real. My goal isn't to speak truth to the medical side of things as much as it is to speak truth to the spiritual side of things. Right. And how we, as followers of Jesus, people who are committed to God, how we move forward in the midst of all of this stuff taking on and happening around us. Good. And how we can respond in a way that isn't just getting us through it, but is both honoring to God and honoring to our neighbors. It's not just something that is, good in that, I believe recklessly in God, and so everything is going to be okay. It's not the end of the world, blah, blah, blah. It's not like this blind or foolish faith, but it's also a sensible grounding in reality and in the truth of who God is and what God desires for us or how God desires for us to go about these kind of situations. Because listen, today it's coronavirus. And for the foreseeable future, we believe it's going to be coronavirus. But I'll tell you right now, you can mark your calendar. 7 to 9 months from now, it's going to be about politics. It's going to be pandemonium about who got elected, who didn't get elected. What's happening there? A year from now, we don't know what it's going to be. But the fact of the matter is that regardless of what the situation is, we as followers of Jesus have the opportunity to move forward in a way that communicates and reveals the hope and the truth of who God is and what he desires for his people. And so that's my goal today, is to kind of establish, or at least lead us to a place of truth where we have the confidence to walk out of this room or to walk out of this space and to be able to hold our heads high, knowing who God is and how we can respond in these kind of situations. And so it doesn't matter if you're here, it doesn't matter if you watched online or listen online or if you travel elsewhere. The truth and the certainty about what I want to share with you today is something you can take with you and feel good that you brought it with you. And I was reminded of a passage a few nights ago in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. And this passage is not really a traditional passage in the way of something that you might read on your own for, like, you know what, I just want to get close to the Lord. Let me open up to 2 Chronicles chapter 20 and see what he wants to speak into me. It's not something you heard about in youth group probably. It's not something that is traditionally preached on, not because it's a bad passage, but because it doesn't always seem to fit the context of a circumstance or a situation that you're in. Yet on Thursday night, as I was thinking about today and as I was praying to God, what is it that I should say? What is it that I should speak? God brought me back to this passage, reminded Ricky, speak into this. Use this. I've already spoken into this situation, so take this and share it with your people. And so I'm going to read, but I didn't put the verses up on the screen because instead I wanted you to be able to find this for yourself. And so if you have a Bible app, if you brought a physical Bible with you, you can go ahead and open to 2 Chronicles chapter 20. I'm reading out of the New Living Translation. You can choose whatever version you're accustomed to or whatever version you prefer or is easier to follow. But 2 Chronicles chapter 20, and there's like 22 verses that we'll kind of work through. And I'm going to work through them, talk, on different points. And then at the end, what I want to share with you are 4 things we need to remember in times of crisis. And so I'm going to teach through these things. And then when we get to the end, I'll share quickly with you 4 things we need to remember in times of crisis. So starting in 2 Chronicles, well, before I do, everyone there? Yeah. All right, good, awesome. So 2 Chronicles chapter 20, starting in verse 1, it says this: After this, the armies of the Moabites, the Ammonites, and some of the Meunites declared war on Jehoshaphat. Verse 2, messengers came and told Jehoshaphat, a vast army from Edom is marching against you from beyond the Dead Sea, and they are already at Hazazon Tamar, which was another name for En-gedi. Now I'm going to pause right here, because listen, here's what ends up happening with fear. Fear spreads like a disease. Fear spreads like a plague, and it spreads much more quickly, much faster than anyone anticipates. Much faster than anyone expects or envisioned it happening. And not only does it spread faster, but it actually intrudes spaces that you would say are mine, spaces that you would say, hey, this belongs to me. This is my heart. This is my mind. This is my body. This is my spirit. This is my apartment. This is my house. And before you know it, fear has encroached there. It's exactly what happened here. The enemy had overcome an entire region and moved across the Dead Sea into En-gedi, which was part of Judah. And it wasn't just one enemy, but it was a lot of enemies. And they had kind of formed this insurmountable force to encroach the people of Judah, the nation of Judah, and the people of Jerusalem. And before they even knew that the enemy was coming, what they found out was that the enemy was already in their territory. And I think if we're honest, some of us probably feel that way to a degree. It's not just that this disease, it's not just that this illness has kind of made its way from a different part of the world to our part of the world, but that the fear that comes with it can encroach our hearts before we even knew that we had to prepare for it to begin with. And that's the kind of thing that happens when things escalate so quickly. And we saw that, we witnessed that this week. As news of different sporting events started to cancel, all of a sudden it moved beyond the realm of sports into larger gatherings on the whole. And then it's moved into, quarantines and isolations. And again, none of those things in and of themselves are bad. But what happens is that because things escalate quickly, fear works at an even faster rate and encroaches our hearts. And all of a sudden you wake up on Friday and you're like, I'm afraid. What happened? What should I do? Should I leave? Should I go? Do I need to go to the store? What do I need to do? Verse 3 goes on. Jehoshaphat was terrified by this news. And he begged the Lord for guidance, and he also ordered everyone in Judah to begin fasting. Now I'm going to pause again, because listen, fear is normal. And in fact, if you feel afraid at all, I want you to know it's okay. Fear is an emotion that we have. Fear is an emotion that we experience. Fear does not come from God, but it is something we encounter. And so fear in and of itself is not the problem. It's what we do with the fear that's the problem. You notice it says Jehoshaphat was terrified, but immediately he went to the Lord. Immediately he called on the people, hey, let's pray, let's fast. Let's redirect this thing that we're feeling in a positive and in a meaningful way and to the one who can actually speak into this. And I think a lot of times with Christians and followers of Jesus, the problem isn't that we experience fear, it's just that we mishandle our response to it. And we allow fear to become our all-consuming thing rather than redirecting and saying, I feel afraid, let me go to the one who can secure me. Let me go to the one who can stabilize me. And Jehoshaphat did just that. So verse 4 continues. So people from all of the towns of Judah came to Jerusalem to seek the Lord's help. Now I'm going to pause again. I told you I'm going to read and I'm going to stop. I'm going to read and I'm going to stop. But I want you to look, every person, to just look behind you. And for some of you, there are people behind you. But for those of you in the back row, there are no people behind you. But imagine there's a figurative person behind you. And the reason I want you to look behind you and the reason I want you to imagine a figurative person behind you is because for every one of you, there is someone in your life who follows your lead. There is someone behind you looking to you to see how you're handling this. It might be a coworker. It might be a friend. It might be a child. It might be a family member. It might be a spouse. It might be your own kids. But someone somewhere in this world is looking to you for help. Just like the people gathered to Jerusalem to look for the Lord's help, someone behind you is looking to you to say, what are you doing? How are you going through this? How can I follow your lead? Because they don't know what to do. Jehoshaphat stood before the community, verse 5, of Judah and Jerusalem and in front of the new courtyard at the temple of the Lord. And again, the community is so important in this, the community aspect, the nature of people getting together to seek something together, to seek something as on the whole and in a unified front. Now, we, of course, are here today in person, but that doesn't mean that this can't happen in a digital capacity or in an impersonal capacity. Because when believers around the world are unified together, seeking God for his wisdom, seeking God for his counsel, God responds, as we'll see in just a moment. Verses 6 and 7 say this. It says, Jehoshaphat prayed, O Lord, God of our ancestors, you alone are God who is in heaven. You are ruler of all the kingdoms of the earth. You are powerful and mighty, and no one can stand against you. O our God, did you not drive out those who lived in this land when your people Israel arrived? And did you not give this land forever to the descendants of your friend Abraham? And I love Jehoshaphat's response in here because the people come to him. He realizes someone behind me is looking to me for guidance. And yes, this is terrifying. Yes, I'm afraid. But you know what? I know where I can go. I know where I can lead them. I know who I can look to. And he doesn't just say, hey, it's God. He speaks to everything that God has done. God, you're the ruler of the nations. God, you're the all-powerful. He speaks the truth of God's characteristics, of God's nature, and of God's heart into a frightful situation. Verse 8, he says, your people settled here and built this temple to honor your name. He goes on in verse 9, they said, whenever we are faced with any calamity such as war, plague, or famine, we can come to stand in your presence before this temple where your name is honored, O God. We can cry out to you to save us, and you will hear us and rescue us. Now I'm going to skip down to verse number 12, because verse number 12 says this as he concludes his prayer. Oh, our God, won't you stop them? But then notice this phrase. We are powerless against this mighty army that is about to attack us. We do not know what to do, but we are looking to you for help. I love Jehoshaphat's vulnerability. I love his willingness to lead and to say, God, I don't know. People of Jerusalem, I don't know. People of Judah, I don't have answers. But I know the one who does. And I know the one who can speak into this. And I know the one who can lead us forward. And I know the one that will guide us. I know who he's been. I know what he's done. And I know that when we come together in heart and in unison and say, God, we are looking to you, that the best thing we could do is just say, God, I can't solve this problem apart from you. I can't solve this problem at all. And it feels like, right, we're in this situation or in this time where we don't really know the answer. We have theories about what we can do and practices that we believe, if we implement these things, will help us navigate through a season like this. And for the record, I agree and believe in those theories. But we ultimately don't know how long is this going to last. Is it 2 weeks? Is it 4 weeks? Is it 6 months? Is this something that's going to affect the majority of the population or a small portion of the population? Is our system, our healthcare system, our political systems, are they suited to leverage or to respond in times like this and to handle an overwhelming or a potential overload of those systems? We don't have those answers. We don't know those answers. And so in times like this, when we're vulnerable and when we're uncertain, we have to look back to God. Verses 13 through 17, it says this: as all the men of Judah stood before the Lord with their little ones, wives and children, the Spirit of the Lord came upon one of the men standing there, and his name was Jehaziel, son of Zechariah, son of Benaiah, son of Jael, son of Mattaniah, a Levite who was a descendant of Asaph. And he said this: listen, all you people of Judah and Jerusalem. Listen, King Jehoshaphat. This is what the Lord says. Do not be afraid. Don't be discouraged by this mighty army, for the battle is not yours, but God's. Tomorrow, march out against them. You will find them coming up through the ascent of Ziz and in the end of the valley that opens into the wilderness of Jeriel. But you will not even need to fight. Take your positions, then stand still and watch the Lord's victory. He is with you, O people of Judah and Jerusalem. Do not be afraid or discouraged. Go out against them tomorrow, for the Lord is with you. And what I love about this portion is that, this guy is a normal guy. He's an average Joe. He's not someone prominent. He's not someone significant. He's not in a position of authority. He's not a delegate. He's not someone who has insider information. He's not any of that. But he stands in the midst of this uncertainty. He declares and proclaims the truth of who God is. And he recognizes that this isn't something we are fighting, but something God is fighting on our behalves. And what that means for each and every one of us is that it only takes, it doesn't take, a medical expert, or it doesn't take a religious expert or a spiritual expert, to have someone with the faith and the confidence to say, you know what, I know who God is. And I know that God's not caught off guard by this. And I know that God's not sleeping on this. And I know that because of God's concern and his care for his people, that God will respond and that God will provide and that God will answer. And in the midst of my fears and in the midst of my uncertainty, I can declare and I can stand up boldly and say, this is who God is and this is what God will do. And I think we live in a world that's so driven by fear, not just with this particular thing. I think this situation actually realizes or reveals, I should say, how much fear we actually operate in on a day-to-day basis. It's amplifying what already exists. And imagine if we flipped that. Imagine if this situation became a pivot point for the church, a pivot point for Christians who would stand in faith and stand in truth and recognize, you know what? I don't need to be a somebody to be somebody. I don't need to have the clout. I don't need to have the status. I don't need to have the following. I just need to be someone who declares the truth of God's love, the truth of God's grace, the truth of God's confidence and his character in any and every situation in my life and in the life of those around me. Because you know what happens then is what happens here. A whole nation pivots. Verse 18, it says, then King Jehoshaphat bowed low with his face to the ground, and all the people of Judah and Jerusalem did the same, worshiping the Lord. And the Levites from the clans of Kohath and Korah stood to praise the Lord, the God of Israel, with a very loud shout. Verse 20, early the next morning, the army of Judah went out to the wilderness of Tekoa. And on the way, Jehoshaphat stopped and said, listen to me, all you people of Judah and Jerusalem. Believe in the Lord your God, and you will be able to stand firm. Believe in his prophets, and you will succeed. Verse 21, after consulting the people, the king appointed singers to walk ahead of the army, singing to the Lord and worshiping him for his holy splendor. This is what they sang: give thanks to the Lord. Notice this: his faithful love endures forever. Years ago, when I came across this passage, I wrote in the margin of my Bible, crazy that they are going to war singing about love. You see, because when you are wrapped and entrusted and enveloped in God's love, you have no fear. First John speaks about this. It says, perfect love casts out all fear. And if anyone lives and abides in fear, it's because they are not experiencing the love of the Father. And so when we confront what's uncertain, when we confront what's unknown, when we step into something that feels frightening, the best thing we can do is envelop ourselves in the love of God and move forward and say, you know what, I'm going to go before this thing. I'm not going to run from it. I'm not going to run into it, but I'm going to stand my ground and stand firm and recognize that God's love is going to lead me forward in the face of fear. That God's love is my shield. That God's love is my weapon. That God's love is my anchor. That God's love is my hope. And they proceeded, and the story goes on to say that the battle was won without them having to do anything, that the enemy defeated itself. And again, I'm speaking here metaphorically. I'm not talking about the practicalities of sanitation and caring for yourself. This is about speaking truth into fear, not speaking truth into a medicinal practice. But I think the victory for us is found in overcoming fear. The victory found is what allows us to move forward despite uncertainty, with wisdom, with a sound mind, with peace of heart. And out of this, there's a lot that I could speak to, but there's just 4 simple things I want you to remember. I want you to take away. I want you to walk away with as we think about this. And the first is really simple. 1, there is strength in numbers. Throughout this entire passage, what you find is that the people who felt vulnerable, the people who felt afraid, actually became a community and gathered together to say, you know what? We don't have enough on our own, but if we're together, we can find hope. If we're together, we can find strength. If we're together, we can find courage. And while this whole situation is creating this thing, in fact, it's what you see happening, is that the number of people gathering actually perpetuates or kind of accelerates the passing of this virus. Listen, when it comes to this, it's not about, hey, let's keep gathering and get a bunch of people together. But what I mean by this is that the enemy's attempt is to isolate you and pull you off. We live in a world where we're more connected than ever. Again, we mentioned there can be some bad with that. But there's no reason that we should walk out of this space and not text each other. There's no reason we can't FaceTime each other and share encouragement with one another. There's no reason we can't take a walk through a park and hang out and talk and build and speak life into one another and speak hope into that. You see, the enemy recognizes there is strength in numbers. And so if I can kind of make them separate, if I can isolate them, then I have the leverage when it comes to fear. But in this, more than ever, we need to be connected. More than ever, we need to speak hope. More than ever, we need to speak encouragement to one another. More than ever, we need to leverage the resources and the abilities that we have to communicate for one another and for the greater good of our world, that we are strong when we are united. And listen, that's not just a religious or a spiritual statement, that's a political statement. When we look at what's happening and we realize this isn't about this party or that party, this is about humanity. And our strength is not in what we choose to divide or separate ourselves from, but in how we choose to unite towards something. And that's always true, regardless of what we're confronted with, regardless of what we're up against. The second thing I want you to remember is this: God is still God. And what I mean by that is that because in times like this, what we'll look to is something, to fill that space. And those of us who are on the fringe, or those of us maybe who feel more susceptible or more vulnerable to fear or to worry or anxiety, will often find ourselves leaning toward this, well, where is God in this? But what you need to know is that this has not caught God off guard. This is not something unforeseen. This is not something that he's missed out on, or that he's, just kind of letting slide by. So, well, Ricky, where is God? And the answer is he's with us. He's partnering with us. He's partnering with the scientists. He's partnering with the researchers. He's partnering with the political leaders. He's partnering with the spiritual leaders. His role is not just to solve problems on his own, but his mission from the very beginning has always been to partner with people. And that's not changed. So when I say God is God, or God is still God, his heart and his role is still in this way, to partner with people to fulfill his purpose on this planet. That's what it was with Adam. That's what it was with Eve. That's what it was with Jesus. That's what it is with us. And so he's not neglected this. It's not like he took a long nap and just woke up and was like, oh, wow, I didn't know what was going on. He is partnering with us to bring restoration and to bring redemption into a broken world. Which leads me to this third thing you need to remember. You need to stand for truth, but you need to speak to hope. You need to stand for truth, but you need to speak to hope. Whenever fear presents itself, we talked about this, whenever fear presents itself, it's always going to try to distort the facts and the reality. And early on in this pandemic, what you saw is people say, oh, it's just like the flu, or it's not that big a deal, or yada, yada, yada. And there was an aspect of people trying to distort an aspect, either out of willful intent or ignorance or whatever. And then now there's a flip side of the pendulum that's like, we've got to, protect ourselves at all costs. But what I want you to know is that we have an opportunity to speak truth practically. We can link to websites and pages of information that are provided to us through our government officials, through health officials. We can share truth wherever misinformation has been passed. But listen, don't be a jerk in doing so. If we've offered truth and we were able to counterbalance it with hope, you know how much better our world would be? You see, I think we've gotten accustomed to just dropping, quote, truth bombs on people. Let me spray them with the facts. Let me hit them with this. Let me let them know that they're wrong and I'm right, or that they're misguided and I'm not. And yet we miss out on the grace, the compassion, and the actual opportunity we have to speak hope. People are afraid, or they're worrying, and they're living in fear. What better opportunity do we have to speak hope into that? Hey, here's truth, but let me share hope with you as well. On the one hand, truth, I'm going to stand for it because God is the author and the source of truth. But on the other hand, I've got to, counterbalance that truth with some hope. Because this isn't something that we're going to get through just by bombarding people with truth. If we're going to get through something, if we're going to navigate through something in a way that's productive and fruitful and invigorating for our church community and for the people around us and for our society, then we have to do it together. And again, these simple things that we can do in any circumstance and in any season make a significant difference. Make a revolutionary difference. You think back to this guy's word. He says, don't be afraid. Don't be discouraged. Don't be afraid. The truth is we know who God is. Don't be discouraged because there's reason to have hope. It's both of these situations. It's not one or the other. It's not, hey, God's got it. Everything's going to be okay. Ignore the truth. But it's also not, hey, here's the truth. It's full-on panic mode. We should be, scared out of our wits. It's here's the truth, but here's the hope. The last thing you need to remember is this. Worship always leads to breakthrough. Worship always leads to breakthrough. In times of fear, when you feel afraid, when you feel uncertain, when you feel worried, when you feel like you're overwhelmed by the circumstances or the situations of life, your personal worship is always going to lead to breakthrough with God. Singing songs, praising Him, thinking about His goodness, thinking about His characteristics, thinking about the truth of who He is, and bringing and responding in light of those things, responding in worship is always going to lead to breakthrough and victory over fear. The enemy wants to silence you. He wants to silence your spirit. He wants to silence your heart. But God always calls His people into worship because worship is a surrendering of, I don't have control, but I also know I don't need control because I know the one who's got the control. And I think collectively, more broadly speaking, when a group of believers, when a church, when the church on the whole responds in worship, what you find is that things change. Not just in a moment, not just in a singular event, but globally. We are entering a time, again, of uncertainty, practically speaking. A time where, we are going to be working remote, distancing ourselves from people, doing these different things that maybe are unfamiliar or that we're unaccustomed to. Yet imagine for just a second, what if you leverage that margin? What if you leverage that time for things that actually would lead you to greater worship? Things like prayer, things like fellowship in a meaningful way. Things like thinking about how could I, deepen my commitment. I don't have this X amount of time that I need to commute anymore. What if I leverage that to strengthen my relationship with God? What if I use that to just send out a text to 15 people and let them know I'm praying specific things over them? What if I did that time to, just face chat with someone who's maybe vulnerable or someone who feels like they're afraid of what's going on and invest in them? What if I let that time just be a time where I meditate and focus and censor my heart and my spirit on who God is? You see, when you worship in that way, it leads to breakthrough. And I think as we pave the way collectively through our worship, it actually provides a path for God to come and respond in the way that we need Him in our lives and in our world. And so I want you, again, if you would, just turn behind you, look behind you, and imagine that figurative person. You probably know them. You probably know all their names, know their situations. And you probably know exactly why they're looking to you. And the best thing that you can do is to remember there is strength in numbers. When we commit and unify our hearts together, we can overcome fear. The best thing you can do is to remember that God is still God. The best thing you can do is to stand for truth and speak to hope. The best thing you can do is to worship, knowing that it's going to lead to breakthrough and victory over fear. And so as we go out, I want to invite you to do that. I want to invite you to remember these things. I want to invite you to hold on to these things. When you feel like you're confronted with fear, when you feel like you're confronted with uncertainty, I want to invite you to respond in these ways. For some, this is something you do frequently. For others, this may be brand new to you. But if you can make this a discipline, then one, for yourself, your heart, your posture will be different. But then the experiences and the circumstances of the people around you will be different as well.